Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name's Nicole, and today I'm going to talk about magical realism and the books that have been a hit for me, as well as some that have been misses as far as this entire genre or subgenre goes. So let me go ahead and start out by talking about what is magical realism, because this is something that a couple of years ago I started noticing kept being mentioned as being a subgenre or a trope that was in a lot of the books that I was reading and enjoying. And so I wanted to learn more about this myself. I wanted to find out more books that were like those books. So I did a little research and started reading more magical realism. The best definition that I found basically described it as the fantastical being present in the real world, but not being the focus. So you're not going to have the fantastical things that are occurring or the magic that's clearly going on in the world talked about or explained. Largely, the characters within the story will seemingly be ignoring the fact that what is happening in front of them is not part of normal everyday life and defies laws of science. So, why do I like magical realism? Well, I have found that I tend to like books that are very theme based and theme heavy, as well as books that incorporate a decent amount of character development and are also at least partially character driven. And so I love magical realism because I think it takes all of those things, but it adds a different twist or perspective to study that character from, other than just like looking at it from the perspective of another character. You sort of add another element of life to talk about the human condition when reading magical realism. And so that's why I tend to like it in my books. I think magical realism is something that a lot of people will like, especially if you already like fantasy. I think magical realism is a really easy subgenre to fall into because it may get you a little bit more on the literary or contemporary side of fiction, but it still adds all those fantastical and magical elements too. I think magical realism is a really good sort of subgenre or writing style or trope, whatever you want to call it, to look into, especially if you like fantasy but you're finding you don't like high fantasy where all the magic is explained in depth and may even feel like, a science book in some ways. I think magical realism is a great way to have a lot of those elements still in your books, but not have to explore them in depth. Magical realism is also great for people who don't like fantasy at all. Maybe you don't want a whole bunch of, the typical fantasy people and things happening in your book, but you're also kind of tired of just the maybe day to day traditional contemporary or literary books where it's the same themes and people just, living real life. Basically, if you would like to move beyond just flat out realism in your book, but you're not ready to go full blown, into the world of fantasy, this may also be a good bridge for you or just a great alternative in general. So let's go ahead and start talking about all the books that I have read that, according to the story graph, contain magical realism in them. I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there's some that I've read that, maybe I haven't inputted into the story graph, or there may be some that the story graph is just not labeling as magical fantasy that would still count as that. So I do have one book that I've read that it was magical realism that I gave a 1 star to. I just absolutely did not like that book, but I'm going to wait and talk about that until a bit later. There is one book that I gave 2 stars to, and that was Beast of Extraordinary Circumstance. This is a book that was about a young boy growing up who has some sort of magic surrounding him. Maybe it's unclear. There's definitely a lot of unusual things that are going on with him, packs of wolves, the weather, you name it. He's a bit of an oddball and kind of lives outside of society. And he runs into a young girl, and the story just tells a story of their relationship over the course of years as they get to know each other, grow apart, kind of move apart, come back together, and on and on. The main reason that I gave this book 2 stars was I just did not feel like the magical realism in this book was done well, predominantly because I felt like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a fantasy novel or a book that just had magical realism in it. In Beast of the Extraordinary, I felt like there was a lot of emphasis on the magic, a lot of questioning whether or not it was magic. And because it kept being questioned whether or not what was happening was real or not real, it kept your focus on the magical elements and a little bit less on how they were impacting the characters because it kept making you think about the magic over and over again. This was definitely not a situation where the characters in the book were ignoring the fact that magical events were happening. They were constantly trying to figure out if the events were happening were just a coincidence or were magic. And there is a place for that in magical realism. I just didn't feel like the balance was struck very well. I felt like the book was longer than it needed to be. And even though I switched to an audiobook at one point, because that will sometimes help me get through sections that I'm just finding kind of dry, I just found that I was struggling with the audiobook as well. I'm actually pretty surprised that I didn't DNF this book. I think I did put it down for a while and then, for whatever reason, decided to finish it. But it just ended up, my first thought on this book ended up being correct, which was I wasn't enjoying it and I probably should have just DNF'd it. I have four different books that I gave 3 stars to, and I'm only going to talk about three of them because, again, one of the books I'm going to talk about later because it's part of the same series that I gave a 1 star to. The first 3 star I gave to was to The Bright Edge of the World. I was really excited to read this book. I had read The Snow Child earlier and just loved the magical realism in that. And it's really interesting because with Eowyn Ivy's works, I find that people either really love The Snow Child or really loved The Bright Edge of the World. But I haven't seen a lot of people who really like both books, and they are very different books. To The Bright Edge of the World, to me, felt more atmospheric than magical realism, even though there were tad bits of it here and there. But again, I felt like when it came up, there was a lot of heavy focus on it. I felt like the book was, again, too long, and I just had too many questions, and at certain points, just didn't care, even though I felt like I should. The next book is The Rain Heron. I really enjoyed reading this book. It had a lot of very tense moments. You definitely had a lot of questions at the beginning of the story that you wanted answered, and you kept reading and kept going. The pacing was pretty well done. There were definitely some like really intense sort of like odd fantastical creatures and moments in this book where you just didn't really know or understand what was going on, and neither did the people in the book, but it kind of didn't matter. Ultimately, what led me to giving this book a 3 star was that I felt like I was being driven through the book by wanting to have questions answered, and those questions never got answered. So it ended up feeling like those moments ended up being more plot holes than anything else, and I ended up feeling very unsatisfied at the end of the book. The third book I'm going to talk about is After Dark. And After Dark is by Haruki Murakami. I think this is the first book that I read by him, and it was so fascinating. There was this moment in the book with one of the two sisters because it tells a story of two sisters, one of whom is maybe missing. That part I was never really clear on. And it's two different timelines, one of what's going on with the one sister who seems to be missing, the other one is with the sister who's still at home, kind of wondering where she is. And you're following what's going on with these two sisters. And with the one sister, there are just the most bizarre, strange things happening to her that you feel like you're in some sort of surreal world and don't really know what's real and what's not real and what's happening and what's not, but it works. What didn't work for me in this book, however, was I was just flat out confused by the end of the book. I just ended the book feeling like, what just happened? What just happened to me? I felt like I woke up after dark. And I still haven't decided whether it was in a good way or not. And so it became a book that I was like, I have to reread that at some point to figure out whether or not I actually do like it. So it's definitely a book that could possibly go up to 4 stars for me or could go straight down to a 2. But I won't know until I reread it. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, Nicole, why are you telling us about books that you don't like? Well, because you may like them. I am very open to the idea that something that I love, someone else might hate, and that's something that I hated, someone else might love. So I figure it's still worth sharing my experience because you might look up these books and you might find that, oh, well, I'm interested in these books. And you might want to know how somebody else thought about them or experienced them. Or if you find that you tend to have very similar reading taste as I do, you might not want to waste your time on some of those books. So I can say my 4 stars and 5 star books are ones that I would recommend to virtually anyone. 4 stars I would recommend to most people, especially people interested in magical realism. 5 star books I generally would recommend even if you don't think you're interested in this genre. So let's go ahead and start by talking about my 4 star picks. The first book I'm going to talk about is Axeman's Carnival. I read this book just earlier this summer and really enjoyed it. It incorporated all the things that I love about magical realism. It had a very unique perspective that the story was told from. It never explained how you got that perspective, it just went from there. There were strange and interesting things that happened throughout the book that just really kept you involved in the story, and you definitely got to see how the magical or fantastical element of the story impacted the characters. And really, I think the entire story couldn't have happened without that perspective and thought. And it took what to me is a theme that is commonly mentioned in books, but told it in a completely new and different way. And I really enjoyed the book. I already mentioned The Snow Child and how I liked that book better than To the Edge of the World. And I have to be honest, this is a book that I keep thinking about and I keep wondering whether it really should be a 5 star for me because it is very tempting to read this book again this winter. The Snow Child is about a young girl who is living in the Alaskan wilderness in the outside as far as this older couple can tell. They have grown old together, they have no children, so of course when they see a young girl wandering in the woods, seemingly by herself, they are very intrigued and start wondering about it. They have a relationship, things go on from there. This story mixes fairy tale with an beautifully described atmospheric Alaskan winter. It is such a good winter read. I can't recommend it enough. The writing is absolutely astounding and beautiful. I loved everything about this book, even though it was a book that I thought for some reason was going to be scary. I still don't know where I got that from. This book is not scary at all. It's a beautiful story that has a lot of interesting themes and insights that come into it and has a lot of very subtle morals and lessons that you could get out of it if you wanted to. I read a few years ago Lonely Castle in the Mirror, and this was another really deep, thought provoking book that used a young middle school girl and just the difficulties and trauma she was having in middle school and explored all of those things through her adventures of kind of like Alice going through the looking glass. So it is definitely got that portal fantasy kind of flair, but I would say it definitely stays more on the magical realism side of things. There is definitely a portal going on here, but there are elements of the book that I feel like don't go fully over into fantasy, which is probably why it stayed a 4. I wanted it to go a little bit more in one direction or the other, but for the most part, I felt like it worked. I felt like the themes that were discussed in this book are so important for parents, for middle school students, for anyone who ever was middle school age. That I just really loved this book and just think it's a really important work in general. I also read All's Well by Mona Awad. This was another bizarre, surreal book that made me go, what is happening in this book? What is happening to me? I generally don't like books where I feel like I don't know what's going on, but somehow in this book it worked. And I feel like it was important that you felt like you didn't know what's going on because it put you solidly in the perspective of the character, where there were moments where there were things going on where you didn't know if it was her, you didn't know if it was you not reading it well, you didn't know if it was the writing style or what. And it all just kind of led into this whole conversation of the themes that were being explored throughout the entire book. Nothing to See Here is a funny, zany little book that I feel like I hear people talk about here and there. I really enjoyed this book. It talked about I don't feel like one particular theme, but a whole bunch of different themes. It definitely had a bit of a found family kind of feel to it, with a really bizarre magical kind of element going on in the background. That was definitely discussed in the book, but not explored. In fact, it added to the comedy of the book that they just kept not exploring it and just were like accepting it, like, yeah, this happened. And I'm not going to share what it is that's happening, but yeah, I think the way that the magical element was ignored is very fitting with the title of the book, because definitely everybody was acting like there's nothing to see here. And finally, I read The Life of Pi. I mentioned this in an earlier video. I think it was my video on the Booker Prize, and I really enjoyed this book. It has a very sort of classic, like, fantasy adventure kind of feel, but is told in a perspective where it's like, no, all of this really happened. And I love that sort of travel adventure. This is my real life narrative perspective. If you like sort of travel adventure narratives where they're playing with the idea of, did this or did this not really happen? Think like Gulliver's Travels. This is a very similar element. The things that kept coming up in this book and happening were just so bizarre and unexpected that it just keeps you reading the book and working through it and trying to figure out what is going to happen to this young boy who is trapped on a boat with a tiger. I mean, that right there is like a super fantastical element in a book. I have my 5-star read. This book was Before the Coffee Gets Cold. To me, this is everything that I love about magical realism. There is an element of this book that almost feels like sci fi or fantasy, again, sort of a portal fantasy kind of feel. There's a very surprisingly worked out element of magic, like it's heavily explained. So, in that sense, I would kind of question whether or not this should be considered magical realism. But I guess the aspect of it where it's just accepted and people go with it is where it hits the realism. Anyway, there is a cafe in this book where people go to where if you sit in this one particular seat and follow all these rules, you can travel back in time to a particular moment in that cafe. And this story has a series of interconnected stories where people are doing this. In case you were wondering, this book is based on a play, and so it does slightly still read like that because there is an odd element in the writing where you'll be like, why are we getting certain things in this book? That's why once I realized that, it helped me settle into the story much more. I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed the themes it discussed. I felt like it was very poignant and hit very hard emotionally. That said, it is part of, I think, a 4 or 5 book series now. And I mentioned earlier in this video, I had a 1-star read and a 3-star read that I wasn't talking about. And those were books 2 and 3 in this series. One of the books, Tales from the Cafe, got a 3-star from me, and Before Your Memory Fades actually got 1 stars from me. And at that point, I quit the series. It was just going downhill and not recovering. Those 2 books became way too predictable and honestly just started over explaining every single person's emotion and feeling and everything that was going on in a book. It didn't trust the reader enough to understand what was happening in the story, and quite frankly became annoying. So while I wouldn't recommend the whole series, I would definitely say read the first book in it and maybe borrow the second book to see whether or not you like it. Okay, so that's it. Those are all the books that I have read according to the story graph that include magical realism in it. And I think you can see the vast majority of them were 4 stars for me. They hit just right. They didn't fall below or leave me questioning like my 3-star books were. And yes, they didn't hit the perfect balance like my 5-star, but overall, I feel like it's generally a winning category for me. I think it has a lot to offer just in terms of changing up the storyline, adding different perspectives or different elements to impact characters in books, and I think is an all around win. I also mentioned earlier that if you're looking for books to read in this category, you could read any of these. Obviously, you can read anything you want, but I personally would recommend to you any of the books that I gave a 4-star or up as great places to start. Next up for me, I will be reading August Town at some point in the month of November, and that book also contains some magical realism. I believe the magical realism in that book has to do with myths from the island of Jamaica, since that's where that book is set. And yeah, if you like this kind of content and you want to hear more about my personal hits and misses in reading, then like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any of the videos that I post where I talk about the books that I am enjoying and the books that I'm not enjoying and everything in between. I think that's it for today. So let me know, do you like magical realism or are you interested in trying some now? And have you read any in the past? And if so, what would you recommend? And yeah, that's it for today. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.